Muy buenos días. Si van tomando asiento, por favor.
Please take your seats, if you don't mind, so we can get started about this seminar about the future of the transatlantic NATO in the next 70 years. If we take a look at the last 70 years, we can say with no doubt that it coincides with the best decades of its member states, both in terms of security as well as in terms of prosperity. 70 years with assumed three major missions: collective defense during the Cold War, the management of the post-war Cold War crisis, and today cooperative security to avoid new forms of war, hybrid, asymmetric, or the future, which seems to be the virtual one. We can say that NATO has succeeded with its goal. It has extended it throughout time, and this is a great success and achievement. It has actually allowed the European Union to invest more money in butter rather than cannons, and in order to construct the most advanced society we've had so far in history. The European Union, Portugal, we owe a lot to the European Union, Portugal and Spain, and to NATO rather. We are not so much concerned about the past, which is important, but rather about the future. What is the future about the Atlantic Alliance in international environment that is constantly changing and which is evolving in an accelerated manner and not for the better? It is indispensable to understand that with the fall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is the best success of NATO, Europe stopped being the strategic scenario in the world, and it lost in terms of relevance in that sense. The aspect of the Soviet the cars of tanks going across France was was amazing. But are we willing, or are we ready to assume the new scenario, the new responsibilities that we have? Then we have China in Asia. Obama with Hillary Clinton started actually conversations, and Trump actually has declared NATO obsolete, and then subsequently declared obsolete his own declaration of obsolescence. Trump cancelled the commercial treaty between the US and Europe, but it launched American first with a blockade in terms of technology, and we don't know whether or not the United States are an ally or a rival, or both things at the same time, depending on the scenario at a point in time and the moods of Mr. President. We cannot deny that the support of the United States has been one of the main pillars of the European Union itself. Today, the American administration was supporting Brexit. It was supporting not to pay. It was actually supporting also the liberal governments of Eastern Europe, and is positioned himself against the European Union. We see the world reorienting itself around the China-United States geopolitical vector. One is the emerging power, the other one is the declining power. Anyway, the US has enormous resources, but we see a declining power vis-a-vis an emerging power. And this is a Thucydides trap, and for that reason, the European Union needs to find its own strategic position. In that sense, Russia, which was called by Obama a regional power, what annoyed greatly Russia. Russia spends a third part of what the European Union spends in terms of defense. Perhaps Russia is a regional power, but it is a regional power in our region, so it is important for us. Therefore, NATO faces a hybrid war in the East, where the defiant attitude of Russia has made allies to deploy troops to protect their borders. We have also needed to launch communication campaigns to counteract the other campaigns, and allies have not really helped, have actually reacted to these allies in order to avoid escalation. The eastern border of the European Union, because Europe is the result of two borders, the southern and the eastern borders. So the eastern border is unstable at the moment and is within the European Union itself. We cannot forget an important variable, the dependence of Europe in terms of energy of Russia. We have opened the southern flank at the same time, which is increasingly relevant. The major border of Europe is religious as well as cultural. There are two historically opposed religions. There is a political border as well, democratic in the north and failed or authoritarian states in the south. And on top of this, there is a demographic border, an aging north and a south that is experiencing a very important demographic explosion, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is an urbanistic explosion as well, and there is the major socio-economic border in the world, because the difference between the per capita income is twice as much as that exists in Rio Grande. So this Mediterranean is a huge breach in that sense. In the southern flank, the challenges are not so visible as the warplanes of Russia. The challenges here are less tangible. There is demography, poverty, social frustration, hunger. These makes progress, but it's doing it in silence. And then there is the Islamic State. Our troops have been fighting the Islamic State, but it is less visible now. And analysts are asking themselves now how and in what sense or what way their combatants appear in scenarios such as the Sahel, or perhaps other scenarios where we will be forced to deploy our forces to combat them. Finally, every time we talk about Atlantism, we focus on the North Atlantic and we forget about the South Atlantic, and I think we should start thinking about the South Atlantic. Portugal and Spain are Atlantic countries and Atlantist countries as well, but we belong to also the Southern Atlantic, which is a space that is also almost empty, and we need to reinforce it. We have different institutes, the Portuguese Institute, the Portuguese Institute of the Lisbon University, and Elcano Institute are trying to understand these challenges in order to make them tangible so that we can recommend NATO action proposals. In the last 70 years, we've seen the different evolutions, and today we are meeting here in Madrid in order to draw attention to the set of our conclusions. And I would like to welcome all those who have come to this event to listen to us and to analyze these questions with us. Thank you very much for being here, and I would like to thank as well the support of the Public Diplomatic Corps of NATO, as well as the other institutions that have supported this event. First of all, I would like to welcome Miguel Fernández-Palacios, representative of NATO, the Spanish representative ambassador of NATO. He's a doctor, he's an ex-ambassador in Ethiopia and Congo, and he is very knowledgeable about everything that we need to know for this round table. Please, I would like to pass the floor to him in order to analyze the first challenges, the main challenges, present and future. After what you have said, I think you covered everything, but still, first of all, I would like to thank Elcano, Real Instituto Elcano, for inviting me to give him the opportunity to reflect upon with you a number of challenges, to have the chance to reflect upon together about the current and future challenges of NATO from a Spanish point of view. And I would like to start by referring to the general title, the next 70 years of NATO. When I read this title, the reference to the next 70 years brought to mind the words pronounced by His Majesty King Philip when he visited the headquarters of the Alliance, when I had the chance to be with him. More specifically, I thought of the words he finally pronounced when he said, and I quote, "I've put an end by underlying the value of commitment." Commitment is a word and a term that defines the Alliance like any other term, especially because it is linked to the values and principles that defines us as free societies. And I would like to underline the firm commitment of Spain with an alliance that will turn 70 very shortly. And I hope that the next 70 years will be essential for the defense of democracy and freedom. I am sure that it will be like this. I share these words and these desires. 70 years is a long time. 70 years have passed since the signature of the treaty was signed, and these 70 years have been 70 years of the defense of democracy and freedom, and together allies have learned to define the concept that defines us, which is collective defense. Without cohesion, there will be no solidarity, and without solidarity, there is no alliance, and without alliance, there is no collective defense. What have we been defending? What need we to defend collectively? What do we need to defend in the next 70 years? I think that the answer to this question, which is a key question, it has more content than we originally thought. In the last 70 years, we defended our national borders, that's obvious, but we have also defended other important borders. The freedom, or the borders of freedom. It is a fact that the Alliance in the last 70 years have defended the values and principles that define us as free societies. And this is very important: freedom, democracy, respect of human rights, the rule of law. All these principles are the principles that were mentioned by His Majesty, the King of Spain, and it was obviously the principles that are enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights, in the Constitution of Spain, in the United Nations Charter, and in the treaties of the European Union. And these are the values that project us towards the future as societies of free citizens who want to live in peace and stability, because only we will be able in this environment to develop and to materialize our rights, to make our societies prosper, and to enjoy the principles of democracy. And this is why, in an environment that it is increasingly unpredictable, NATO constitutes a tool of utmost importance in order to keep us united. And I'm referring to the governments of both sides of the Atlantic, united to defend a kind of peace that has allowed us, obviously there are shadows, but has allowed us to build in the last 70 years an international society which has forgotten really about worldwide conflicts. After the between the First and Second World War, there were 20 years. There was a lapse of 70 years. But the last 70 years, the world has not been launched into a global nuclear concept of unpredictable consequences. Is related to the signature of the Treaty of Washington and the creation of the Atlantic Alliance. The alliance is a military and political tool which is essential for the security and the defense of our world, and more specifically the defense of Europe. However, allow me to briefly refer to where is the Atlantic Alliance today. and which is the role played by Spain today within the alliance. In order to do that, I think it is necessary to refer first of all to a theory that I have elaborated myself, personal terror theory, but it's what I call the theory of the security table. The security of Spain, and I'm referring to external security, could be represented with the figure of a table with 4 legs. The actual table will be the Spanish security, and each leg will be the 4 pillars on which Spanish security lies. The first leg, the first pillar, is represented by the flag of Spain. Security is especially a national responsibility, and therefore I need to maintain my security forces operational so that this leg is strong and the table is strong and stable. The second leg is represented by the leg of the United States, and this is obviously, the reason is because we have a special relationship with the United States. We all know the Convention of Cooperation and the different protocols signed that allows for the United States not just to be in Rota and Moron, and this is a solid leg. The third leg, which is also very important, is the leg represented by Europe. Spain believes firmly in the need to strengthen the European capacities in terms of defense, to be able to, as Europeans, defend any crisis that might actually arise in the current crisis and crises that might arise in the future. And we need to be to have this leg to be very robust. And the fourth leg is represented by the flag of NATO. And in this case, we cannot really allow for this leg to be weak, because then we will have an unstable security table. But there is a cover that covers this table, which has the colors of complementarity and synergies and cooperation. And this is something that's important for the European Union and for Washington as well. I would like to focus now on the leg represented by NATO, which is my leg, if you like. And in that sense, I would like to go back to the principles and values that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, of my presentation. I would like to remind you about the words. I mean, when we joined NATO in 1982, the first words pronounced by the Atlantic Council were pronounced by Carlos Sotelos, as well as the Ministry of José Pedro Pérez Llorca. Pérez Llorca in those days was the first time that he spoke at the Atlantic Council, and he said that mainly it was for the defense of freedom, pluralistic democracy, and the constitutional norms and principles that ensure this free societies and democratic societies. This can be said today, and therefore the values we supported in 1982 are the same ones as we support today. These are the values that define our modern society, which is committed to freedom. And also, I would like to say something else. 2 days after Pérez Llorca retired from the public life, that actually I would like to mention Don Juan Carlos, King Don Juan Carlos. King Don Juan Carlos was actually aware that in order to maintain democracy in Spain, there was a need to ensure the belonging of Spain in Europe and in the Atlantic Alliance, in order to modernize Spain, and King Juan Carlos was very aware of this. Dear friends, Spain is no doubt stronger now thanks to NATO, and is more secure thanks to NATO. And I'm sure that the Spanish population is aware of this as well. And I would like to mention the result of the barometer published by this House today in order to actually test the commitment of Spain with NATO. And in this barometer, 75% of Spanish people agree with belonging to NATO, to remain in NATO. And these data show very clearly which is the feeling of belonging that Spanish people have, because when we want to belong to a community of democratic values and shared security. And our armed forces from the very beginning showed that, and still show this commitment with the values of the alliance. Wherever a soldier of the alliance, Spain has been part of it. We have been part of most of the operations and activities of the alliance. We're in the eastern region with a reinforced presence, and in the Baltic we are committed with the Afghanistan security, with the security of the Turkish airspace. We are in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic with the NATO flag. We are committed to security in the southern border, and Spain is present, and Spain is respected in NATO. And NATO faces today a strategic environment that combines different adversaries. Some of them are known to us, that are on the part today of the current affairs, and some new ones, like the hybrid threats or the cyber threats, or even the increasing influence by China, which you have already mentioned. And I would like to mention Russia first of all. Everyone knows that in 2014 Russia annexed Crimea illegally, and that was a problem for NATO. NATO was actually focused on managing crisis after the Twin Tower attack. NATO actually focused on Afghanistan, and then we had reduced that position, but then we had the World Summit where there was a recognition that there was a new renewed Eastern adversary, and a number of measures were implemented in order to reinforce the Eastern European countries and to help the most exposed partners. I'm referring to Ukraine. Still, there was dialogue with Moscow in the Council, NATO-Russia Council. Last year, a number of meetings in Brussels reconfirmed that there was a reinforcement of our defense position, and that there was a reinforcement of dialogue, and that this was the way to go, and this is the way we are going along. Perhaps the most important measures of this reinforcement were the EFP, 350,000 Spanish effective in Latvia are deployed, and some others in Lithuania. But I would like to focus on Russia and INF. This is a dossier that it is worrying. The treaty of signed by the Soviet Union and the NATO signed in '87, it is fundamental for the Atlantic security because it eliminates a number of nuclear wars that were a threat for Europe in the 80s, conventional missiles, nuclear missiles with a range of 500 kilometers, and this was very important because a number of war that were able to transport warheads, nuclear heads, was eliminated as a threat. But Russia in the last few years has actually deployed some middle-range weapons, 9M, 72M or SSC-8 in NATO nomenclature. It is a mobile missile, very easily hiding, and it can actually transport warheads. It diminishes also, it is an actual threat, and it is not a minor threat. We consider that this new system violates the INF, and the US has been denouncing this since the Obama administration. Even officially, in 2013, the Allies agree with the fact that Russia is not fulfilling his obligations in the frame, in virtue of or under the INF Treaty. The US decided to suspend the obligations under this treaty, and Russia announced the suspension of their obligations as well. However, the alliance would like to keep this treaty, and we are, as alliance, fully committed to preserving weapon control internationally, and we need for no proliferation to be a fact for the security of our region. Spain, as a part of this process, is a very proactive country, because we don't want to have a legal gap that would actually create more problems. And we need to take into account other nuclear actors.
Potencia.
At any rate, I just wanted to lay this on the table. This is a very complex and delicate issue which threatens our security, and I think we should make our best to try and prevent it. The second element is terrorism. The chairman referred to it as well. According to the joint threat analysis of NATO, terrorism is the second main threat that we face. Remember, in 2014, Crimea, Daesh, the alliance started to become aware of the problem, and it started to draft a plan to fight against terrorism that was approved in the summit of 2017. And without referring to South, I will refer to ISIS, Daesh, and all these pressures that started to change the situation in the strategic scenario. There are two complementary concepts, which are deterrence and defense, and prevention. This is very much related to the fight against terrorism. All of this with a 360-degree view, because security is not a separate thing. Is not divided into silos, it's indivisible. Let me refer now to another great issue that we face at the Alliance, which is a new frontier, the new cyber frontier. Everyone knows that NATO faces today a very complex strategic scenario. The front, if there's such a thing, of a future conflict will happen in our living rooms. Anonymous citizens will become the #1 target of our adversaries. 5G is going to bring about great benefits, but it will also pose a lot of threats if we're not careful. And NATO is very much aware of this. At the Wales summit in September 2014, it was acknowledged that a cyber attack could lead to could trigger the invocation of one of the articles of the Declaration of Washington. And cyber attack was also considered yet another type of attack in Warsaw 2016. All of this has led to the commitment on cyber defense. But I don't want to dwell on this. I'm just saying that in the next few years, we will have to get used to the concept of resilience, which may sound new to some, but which comes from development policies. And we now talk about resilience of countries in cyberspace, the ability to resist cyber attacks, and if they should happen, make sure that they cause as little impact and as little damage as possible. This is a concept that NATO is working very hard on. And let me now use a pun of words, or pun on ideas rather, in order to be thought-provoking. In the classical definition of war treaties, we hear that cavalry is a well-organized, flexible, and instructed group to carry out actions that allow it to act independently and become the first force. Cavalry is particularly good at reconnaissance. Its flexibility allows us to adapt to critical situations. It may focus on just one target or several, and in fact, the cavalry in the 19th century was based on the horse. Cavalry in the 20th century was made up by tanks, and cavalry in the 21st century will be cybernetic. And this will be the case because our cyber capabilities will have to be well prepared, its users well trained, and this cyber cavalry will have to undertake missions that allow it to act in an independent way, but in coordination with the core of the forces. This new cyber cavalry will be characterized by fluidity, flexibility, and it will be inspired in the same principles it did in the 19th and 20th century. This metaphor takes us to the previous centuries. So with this metaphor, I'm just trying to say that the depth of the waters that we're about to tread is particularly important. We're now going into times of change, revolutionary changes in our ideas of threat and conflict. So we'll have no choice but to adapt ourselves, including Spain. And let me talk now to hybrid wars. This is something that concerns NATO a lot. A hybrid war that combines conventional and non-conventional resources, cyber attacks, misinformation, propaganda campaigns, sabotage, covered operations, orchestrated events, things used by our enemies to weaken our own societies. The response of NATO has been to start taking steps. We're trying to assist already countries that may be subject to a hybrid attack. NATO has already accepted that a hybrid attack of enough intensity might lead to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty and collective defense. Also, an attack on China would affect security and many other things. Until now, it was thought that this was not the competence of NATO, because the Washington Treaty talks about the Euro-Atlantic area. But in a global world, anything that happens in China has security implications for Europe and for NATO. NATO hasn't said yet whether China is a challenge or an opportunity, but I think we will find multiple answers. This Asian giant offers many opportunities to cooperate, but it's also a risk and a threat in areas referring to security. And I'm thinking here about 5G. But let me repeat, for the time being, China is not part of the analysis of threats. Lastly, I'd like to refer to two files that mark the agenda of the alliance. Number one, European defense, and secondly, battle sharing at the Foreign and Defense ministerial meetings. This is a common topic. As a member of NATO and the EU, Spain believes in an ambitious European defense policy that improves our efficiency to face challenges that affect our own security, so that responsibilities can be better shared between both sides of the Atlantic. We Europeans should be more responsible about our own common defense and security. All of this in line with NATO. We believe we need to maintain the transatlantic link, our solidarity, preventing duplicities and overlappings with the alliance. And this is something that Spain defends at the Council. as well. We need also to share the load with cash capabilities and contributions. But I'd like to say that Spain has a defense budget of 0.93 of our GDP. We want to reach 1.53%. We will go to 21 million in the next few years, and Spain contributes to a greater extent to those operations of the alliance, the third C. So in proportion to our defense budget, we are the #1 contributor to operations. We contribute last generation capabilities, the new frigates, F-110, FK. These are all proofs of Spain's commitment with the national pillar of defense, but also with the Wales Summit commitment. But it's not, it's also true that the sharing of the burden should not conclude by 2024 for different reasons, 3 of them. This won't happen because the world in 2024 will not be like the one in 2014. It will be a more complex world with more need to invest in defense. We will continue to share the burden because unless we're able to maintain the INF or prevent its death of a new start by 2021, the assertive part of the work will require more investments, and we will continue to discuss burden sharing because the main threats will change dramatically. We will maybe have nuclear threats again, let's hope not, but also cyber threats. I will conclude with just a few conclusions to give you some food for thought. First, the role of Spain in the new strategic environment. I have described the current strategic scenario as a complex one, and I think everyone here will share this definition with me. We have traditional and new adversaries, hybrid, cyber. So we're not talking about race with different players, countries. No, we're talking about triathlon now with many different players, many different races going on. The 21st century is that of a diplomatic theater. So I believe Spain should be prepared for this multiple competition. And in this new sport, new capabilities will be required, new efforts, both human and financial, and new commitments, of course. It's legitimate to have a national defense policy, but I think that Spain, because of its tradition, its geostrategic position, must play in all the big leagues. And we have to do it also because of the values we uphold and the ones we want to project to the world. We believe in preventive diplomacy, peaceful resolution of conflict, and that's what NATO is. It tries to prevent conflict as a defensive alliance that it is. So we need this for effective multilateralism. The Atlantic Council is one of the great international councils to do foreign policy, where Spain sits with almost 30 allies, including the US, Turkey, the UK, which will soon not be part of the European Council. And as Spaniards, in this new strategic environment, we should take advantage of this fact. My second comment is about the nuclear scenario. The fall of the Berlin Wall meant that people stopped worrying about nuclear weapons. People didn't think that it would be part of future threats. But as long as there are nuclear weapons, NATO will be a nuclear alliance. This is something we've repeated in all of our reports. But it's also true that in the last 30 years, it was more of a protocolarian thing. And we started to talk about failed states, Islam, hybrid and cyber threats. But now, with the revision of the INF, this nuclear threat has come back onto the table together with all the other ones that I mentioned before. My third conclusion, in order to give you some food for thought, as I said, has to do with new opportunities for a Spanish and a global defense industry. I'm fully convinced that the feasibility and sustainability of a Spanish defense industry in a complex and ever-changing scenario must be a shared task for governments and private companies. This is an opportunity for the Spanish industry to grow a very good Spanish industry. So I think institutional support is essential for the creation of synergies. But it's not all institutional support. In a highly competitive world, knowing the strategic, the legislative scenario, and many other things, optimization of resources, economies of scale, research, development, and innovation, and international alliances are the key ingredients of success. I think all of these ingredients are key. And there's also the world of IE applied to weapons, autonomous weapons. And all these ingredients in this formula will be necessary if we want to be competitive and use instruments that will allow us to defend and uphold the values we believe in. Again, let me insist on the cyber threat or challenge. It's going to require much of our attention and resources in the future. Soon we will have a 5G cell phone in our hands. But what will happen in 2050? We don't know. Things change very fast. New technologies change the way we live and the way we relate. And those new technologies can bring about a lot of benefits, but also severe and serious security challenges if we don't use them right. At the embassy, I always like to say that we may have a 5th-generation aircraft, but if there's a person in his home, in his pajamas, hacking the plane from his computer, what's the good of having a 5th-generation aircraft? This is probably the most critical of the critical threats we face from a cybernetic point of view. And let me conclude with a 5th comment about our main adversary. The great challenge for NATO in its 70th anniversary is not China nor Russia nor international terror. It is the perception that citizens of allied countries, especially the young ones, have of the need for the existence of NATO. 70 or 74 years, rather, without a world war, which has made it possible for the world to grow in an amazing way on both sides of the Atlantic. But unfortunately, the fathers of the alliance are no longer here. And the new generations, not only in Spain but in all allied countries, people forget that NATO was an essential element to prevent global conflict, or global war. These new generations believe that peace and security are to be taken for granted, are guaranteed. And they believe that if our societies do not see our adversaries as such, there will be no adversaries. Let me conclude by saying that the history of the alliance is a success story, and to underscore the principles that we've used as a basis, convinced that Respect for those values is key. Respect, solidarity, etc. The relevance of the transatlantic link, commitment with democratic values. All of this is still very much needed. And we Spaniards are not guests of the alliance. No, we're full-fledged members. It is our alliance, and its challenges and opportunities are ours as well.
Muy bien. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miguel, for this wonderful presentation about the current state of the alliance, its immediate future, and the Spanish participation in NATO. Next time I visualize viruses in networks, I will think about galloping horses, which is much more beautiful as an image. I forgot to introduce Antonio Oyarzabal, member of our Board of Trustees, and General Felix Sanz, who's a member of our Scientific Council. Thank you, General, for being here. So let's begin now with the discussion panel. Patricia Denhart, main analyst of the Português International Relations Institute, Nuno Pinheiro from the Ministry of Defense, Elena Gomez Castro from the Spanish Ministry of Defense. This is really an impressive audience.
Gentlemen, my name is Patricia Denhart. I'm a researcher at the Portuguese Institute for International Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this conference organized by the Real Instituto Elcano, to which I give my warm thank you, and in collaboration with IPRI, the Portuguese Institute for International Relations, on this occasion to celebrate NATO's 70 years. I'm delighted to welcome you all here at the Bertelsmann Foundation in this wonderful theater. While we might not get a crowd as a Saturday's Champions League final here in the same city, I'm sure that we'll have a very good debate and a very good discussion on what the future of the Transatlantic Alliance is and on NATO's next 70 years. And in fact, while we are going to address NATO's challenges for the next decades, it's important to briefly remind ourselves that NATO was created as a political and military alliance 70 years ago with the purpose of guaranteeing peace and stability in Western Europe and to deter the Soviet Union from launching an attack against it. NATO became the most important collective defense organization in the Euro-Atlantic area, and in fact it became the most important collective security organization in the world, and still remains so, I would argue. And it survived the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union by institutionally enlarging to take in Eastern European countries and by adapting to a changing world. The attacks of 9/11 meant that NATO now engaged in crisis management operations and engaged in military operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and later on in Libya. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 again changed its focus, leading NATO to return to its core business of collective defense among its member states, as much as it engages in cooperative security and in combating terrorism as its other tasks. At the same time, hybrid threats and cyber defense have been added on to NATO's new main tasks. In this ever-increasingly complex world, NATO faces a multiplicity of new challenges, some internal, some external, and what is more dire, it faces them simultaneously. This raises numerous questions. How to strengthen the internal cohesion of the transatlantic security community created during the Cold War, based on a commonality of values, and on the idea of a political alliance. At a time when the US president demands European allies pay 2% of their GDP for defense, and at a time when there is increasing transatlantic divergence over how to deal with Iran and the JCPOA treaty, trade, climate change, Venezuela, how to ensure a not too divergent worldview, and how to deal with a president who has, in fact, an anti-EU view, and in a time of uncertainty regarding the future of the INF Treaty. On the other hand, how to ensure that a common threat perception among NATO member states can be promoted, and how to adapt to the changing nature of warfare in the new domains such as cyberspace and artificial intelligence. How to address the multiplicity of these threats, which are geographically dispersed, such as, for example, Russia's actions in the East, or, for example, the Sahel in Northern Africa, and which pressure NATO to find common answers in a time of global systemic power transition, and where we are only beginning to have to look at China in our strategic outlook. To address these and other issues, I'm very honored and very happy to moderate this morning's panel, composed of 3 distinguished speakers. I will introduce them individually and then give them the floor. I will ask each speaker to speak for 10 to 12 minutes so as to allow us to have a good Q&A session. And first, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Nuno Pinheiro Torres, who is Director General for National Defence Policy at the Portuguese Ministry of Defence, and who will focus on EU-NATO relations and address the broader question and difficult question of how to strike the right balance between European strategic autonomy and transatlantic burden sharing. Nuno, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. I am going to start by saying hello to everyone here present at this event, at this venue. I'd like to thank the invitation as well by Real Instituto Elcano and the Instituto Português of Relações Internacionales. I am going to speak first of all in English because my Spanish is not good enough to write in this language.
An almost impossible task, as Patricia just mentioned, to build a bridge between EU and NATO, having as tools 2 of the most contested and politically divisive concepts, European strategic autonomy and transatlantic burden sharing. How can we reconcile autonomy with sharing? Imprudently, I accepted the challenge, knowing that I'm sailing in troubled waters. My initial intervention will be divided in 3 parts. The first part, I will address the concept of European strategic autonomy. In the second part, I will try to explain briefly the origins and the written commitment and current understanding of the transatlantic burden sharing. Then I will conclude in the third part with some thoughts on how to balance those 2 apparently colliding concepts. To set the stage, I will recall a well-known dialogue between Humpty Dumpty and Alice from the book Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. I believe you all know. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. End of quotation. The concept of strategic autonomy, as Alice put, is one of a kind that can mean many different things according to the messenger, and may have different interpretations depending if the listener is on this side or on the other side of the Atlantic. Truly, the concept of strategic autonomy in itself is rather abstract and encompasses the appropriate level of ambiguity that allows different understandings and conflicting perceptions. It does not come as a surprise that, in the last couple of years, many think tanks, including Real Instituto Elcano, issued papers proposing possible interpretations and trying to guess the political intention behind the use of this concept. It seems kind of a Sisyphus task. What does strategic autonomy mean? In broad terms, the concept of strategic autonomy in defense can be pursued in three different domains that are somewhat connected: the political, the operational, and the industrial domain. Let's apply these dimensions to the defense in the European Union. Political strategic autonomy for the EU would mean the ability to take decisions and implement them in the field of defense, not depending on third countries. I guess no one challenges that dimension. Of course, the ability to implement the decisions taken requires, in addition, the ability to carry out missions and operations on its own, which leads us to the second dimension, the operational strategic autonomy. Moreover, the ability to carry missions and operations is dependent on the existence of capabilities and enablers, and on the interoperability, readiness and deployability of the EU member states' armed forces. And this takes us to the last dimension, the industrial strategic autonomy. More difficult to grasp, but a priority set forward in the EU strategic documents, linked to the development of a stronger and more competitive European defence technological and industrial base. We can find references to the strategic autonomy in the new European Union Global Strategy on Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from June 2016. In the foreword by the High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini, it is stated, and I quote, "The strategy nurtures the ambition of strategic autonomy for the European Union." Well, Humpty Dumpty would be happy with this generic and vague formulation. And it is, in fact, it can mean many things. The concept of strategic autonomy is further developed in the implementation plan on security and defense, adopted by the Council decision of 14 December 2016. In my view, the most important reference to strategic autonomy is in this document, the implementation plan, with the following words: Europe's strategic autonomy entails the ability to act and cooperate with international and regional partners whenever possible, while being able to operate autonomously when and whenever necessary. This is the essence of the European strategic autonomy. If there is an agreed EU level of ambition with specific types of possible missions and operations, then the EU should be able and capable on its own of undertaking them. We can propose the idea of autonomous operational ability with all it implies as the main meaning of the European strategic autonomy. However, on the other side of the Atlantic, and even in NATO, the concept has been received with distrust. Even worse, was perceived with a negative connotation, as if Europe was in the process of disengaging from the United States and developing a defence union, ultimately to become independent from US capabilities. We should reassure our allies that it is not the case. In reality, and considering the United States, have been calling for more than a decade for more Europe on defence, the noise and grievance against European strategic autonomy has much more to do with a kind of trade war in defence equipment. If the European strategic autonomy requires, as an instrumental part of it, the enhancement of the European defence technological and industrial base, goal that is absolutely legitimate, then there may be less necessity to buy American military equipment. As you all know, the Americans don't buy much European equipment, military equipment, and the trade balance on defense is massively in favor of the US. To sum up, strategic autonomy is a catch concept, or a buzzword, that can have different meanings. And that was enough to steer the discussions within the European Union and across the Atlantic. The EU coined a concept that can mean so many different things, to recall Alice's dialogue. However, once it was adopted, it's our duty to give some useful and positive meaning. The issue of the transatlantic burden sharing is nothing really new. In fact, it's part of the essence of the alliance. Since its origin, the alliance relied on the US commitment to the security of Europe, the compromise of the European allies to hold a greater share of the burden, as they were, at that time, recovering economically. To share the burden is to share the responsibility to the security and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. Well, this is still valid in the 21st century. In the core tasks and principles of the current NATO strategic concept, adopted in the Lisbon Summit in 2010, it is stated that the security of NATO members on both sides of the Atlantic is indivisible, and that the allies will continue to defend it together on the basis of solidarity, shared purpose, and fair burden sharing. As we are all aware, what happened in the last decades was a steady decrease in the defense budgets of many European countries, including Portugal and probably Spain. This decrease was the immediate consequence of the changing security environment with the end of the Cold War, as a peace dividend. And more recently, the global financial crisis that wrecked the public finances of many European allies. So, while the United States was keeping high levels of defense spending, European allies were disinvesting in their armed forces. A persistent call came from the other side of the Atlantic for the Europeans to invest more, done by many secretaries of state and many secretaries of defense. I could recall the appeals of the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in the late 90s regarding the fair burden sharing with the famous 3 Ds. Not diminish NATO's role, not duplicate NATO's capabilities, and not discriminate against any NATO non-EU member. Or the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, in 2011, that warned Europeans of a dim, if not dismal, future for the alliance if the trend of cutbacks was not reversed. However, it was only in the Wales Summit in 2014 that commitment was written down and adopted by all heads of state and government. In fact, the 2% target was not really new. It had been around for quite a while without tangible results. So, to put in writing in a summit was the way found to make it more compelling and have an agreed and approved commitment to put pressure on and demand on the ones that were not fulfilling it. During the negotiations that led to the pledge, the 2% guideline was a kind of an horizon where all the defense budgets should aim to reach, not a mandatory finish line. However, in the next 2 summits, Warsaw and Brussels, it turned out to be the only criteria to judge the allies. Burden sharing is much more than raising budgets to a certain magical number. I will argue that transatlantic burden sharing by the European allies can be achieved collectively through the development of an EU defense pillar. With this, I will go to the third and last part of my intervention. To strike a balance between European strategic autonomy and transatlantic burden share is easier to say than to do. Considering the already very high level of US contributions in capabilities, the reinforcement of NATO requires more investment in defense on the European side of the Atlantic. Having that in mind, the EU engaged in a more coherent and effective capability development process, overcoming the fragmentation of the Member States' armed forces. The final goal is to have the armed forces of the Member States more operational, through enhanced interoperability of their military equipment and increased readiness of their forces. There is only one way for the European Union to become a credible security provider and provide with its fair share of responsibility for the Alliance's ultimate goal: to develop cooperatively capabilities that have been identified as shortfalls and are needed for Europe to operate autonomously whenever required. Let's not forget the lessons from the past. The NATO Operation Unified Protector in 2011 in Libya showed the harsh way how the European allies were dependent on many US enablers like ISR and air refueling, and had critical shortfalls like smart munitions. Sometimes the choice of words like strategic autonomy without a precise content and prone to ambiguity, if not explained in a clear manner, raises unnecessary distrust and jeopardizes the cooperation required in a more complex and disputed security environment. Let us be straightforward. EU strategic autonomy in defence is not against NATO or the US. It is in favour of the overall strength of Europe and, therefore, reinforcing NATO's military power. So, European strategic autonomy should be developed as a meaningful and effective contribution to the transatlantic burden-sharing, and at the same time must be perceived as such, namely in NATO. To conclude, it is paramount to avoid disputes between the two sides of the Atlantic over a concept that, if not qualified, risks becoming toxic. One way of overcoming these misunderstandings is for the EU institutions, mainly the European External Service, to draft a framework document explaining the purpose and content of European strategic autonomy. And now the strength of the European defence pillar will improve our common security. If the European Union and the Member States don't engage in that clarification, the concept of strategic autonomy will mean what anyone chooses to mean. And that free interpretation of an ambiguous concept will keep on being the source of division among allies. Thank you.
Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Elena Castro, who is Director General for Policy at the Spanish Ministry of Defense, and who will speak to us about the link between state fragility and counterterrorism, looking specifically at the context of NATO's southern neighborhood. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Autoridades civiles y militares.
Civil authorities, military authorities, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Real Instituto Elcano and the Portuguese Institute of External Relations for having invited me to talk and reflect upon with you about this topic in the framework of the celebrations of the 70th anniversary of the Atlantic Alliance. Terrorism marks the beginning of the 21st century. There have been a number of replications in Madrid, London, Paris, Brussels of the 9/11 attacks, and the interruption of the Daesh in 2013-14 with the proclamation of the Caliphate changes the security environment. As Malouf says in Imbalances of the World, this time is sometimes described as a precipice. This is a phenomenon that has no precedence in history. This is a new reality with new questions, especially as to how to tackle them and with tools on how to answer. The proliferation of conflict from the Sahel to Afghanistan and the Middle East has created the greatest movement of population since the Second World War, which has been overwhelming for the neighboring countries, especially Mediterranean countries. This has made emerge new and emerging dilemmas in our societies. And the new phenomenon that perhaps could characterize this new reality is what General Rupert Smith called the wars between people or among people without defined armies, but the enemy is among the people, and this gives rise to new problems as to how to tackle this how to answer the situation. The fragility of the state, the collapse of the state is a major problem that actually fuel the major problems and the major evils of our times. As to the origin of threats, it is true that they are increasingly diffuse, dispersed, and complex, and sometimes they have no military origin, but they require a military answer, because in order to create a stable and peaceful and protected environments for population, and also to obtain intelligence and knowledge of environment so that there is a diminished damage is avoided, and to avoid the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. NATO started to tackle this beyond the Balkans in the Middle East, the Balkans was in the heart of Europe, and this is where there was a test area to work in collaboration and also with third countries, and how to manage an intervention with 50 countries in Afghanistan to create a stabilization. In 2014, there was, first of all, the illegal adherence of the Crimea Peninsula by Russia and the creation of the Caliphate by the Daesh. I think NATO was better prepared for the first challenge than for the second one, even though in terms of the first challenge it was a tradition. However, in the second case, Afghanistan has provided the capability to deploy the expeditionary capability, the ability to work with third parties, even though it gave rise to a dilemma because the huge dimensions of the problem, which made them unpredictable. In NATO, almost all documents are classified, and therefore we here speak about the alliance when there are summits, through communiques or through strategic concepts. It is true that this is the doctrine where the alliance relies. Terrorism is mentioned in a generic way in 1991 and in the documents of 1999, in order to remember the interests, to remain in mind that the interests of the alliance can be also attacked by terrorist attacks, sabotage attacks, etc. In 2010, in the strategic document in Lisbon, terrorism was actually mentioned as a major threat. As a direct threat. And in this document, it was the modern technology was emphasized when it was said that this threat was increased by modern technologies. It was also said that cyber attacks and other attacks could be carried out by terrorist groups or extremist groups against the alliance interests. And therefore, it was said that there was a need to strengthen our capabilities to identify and analyze those threats, to organize more consultations and develop the military capabilities that were appropriate, as well as strengthen political consultations. To fight, the fight against terrorism through military organization has given rise to a number of problems and questions, and some people think that armed forces are the best tools in order to face those threats. However, I invite you to read the communique of the Brussels summit issued in 2018, where it is said that even though nations are primarily responsible for their security, national security, and their national resiliency, the NATO adds an added value and has a role to play in complementarity with the efforts deployed by the international community as a whole, in agreement and with the international legislation and the Charter of the United Nations. Cooperation within the alliance can strengthen the national efforts and the capacity to mitigate and prevent any terrorist attacks and be resilient in the face of those. It is also said that the role of NATO in the face of terrorism is an integral part of the 300 of the alliance to dissuade and to project stability, and therefore it contributes to the three major tasks of the alliance: collective defense, management of crisis, and cooperative security. It is said in this document also that through third country cooperation, that resilience will be increased, and therefore a common security area will be able to be created. These are the principles where the strategy against terrorism is created within the NATO, and it is important to take into account that there are three major functions that are under threat, because terrorism is transversal, and which includes elements that are not just clearly tourist elements. Cyberspace, for instance, is one of them. The establishment of certain elements, such as the regional hub south, which have been set in Naples in order to increase the awareness and intelligence of the efforts coordinated with the southern Mediterranean countries, and also the intelligence, in other words, and the creation of the establishment of Secretariat for Intelligence in the south of Europe is important. So there is a transversal view across the board, and also this new view affects the three major pillars of the NATO. And this, on the one hand, gives sense to what the alliance is doing, and it shows the scope and the importance and relevance of these actions. In terms of the NATO operations developed by the NATO, which have been of deterrence and defense, the only time the Article 5 was invoked was because of a terrorist attack, and the only naval operation was launched after the 9/11 attacks, and therefore the first operational element of defense and the first element is defense and deterrence. Afghanistan was the second area of testing, and in Afghanistan and the expeditionary capabilities of NATO were reinforced, as well as their capabilities to work with other countries, and this contributed to the efforts. And the major third element is Iraq and the collaboration of the participation and engagement of NATO within a global alliance. This is one of the elements, or another element, which is referred to in order to speak about the sense of NATO. Because to fight Daesh, there was a global coalition led by the US. And it is true that it was not led by NATO, but without NATO, this coalition would have been impossible. All allies are engaged and involved in the global coalition against Daesh, and many of those countries that had been working with the Atlantic Alliance in Afghanistan are part of this global alliance and global coalition, and therefore, even though it is led, the response is not led by NATO. Without the existence of NATO, this wouldn't have been possible. What did the alliance did? First of all, provide support elements with AWACS in order to facilitate intelligence to those that were operating in Iraq and Syria. Secondly, in the face of the Syrian crisis, it allowed to strengthen the air defense against ballistic missiles, and in the eastern border, which is the closest to the region, and also it became member of the coalition. NATO became member of the coalition in 2017, and finally established a number of collaboration or cooperation measures in different partnerships. First of all, in Jordan, a partnership in Jordan, in another one in TCDI, in order to set up last year, to establish, the Iraq NATO mission which had a training mission or training character, a more strategic character to strengthen the defense sector through training. These are aspects where NATO can add value, because at the end of the day we need to transform the European armed forces, and this transformation has been thanks to the joint efforts within NATO. And therefore, NATO has very good experience when it comes to working with third parties. When I was referring before to the last summit and the need to work with other partners, I mean that there has been evolution since 2013. There was a Mediterranean dialogue, the Istanbul Initiative and others. Through the INSAF cooperation approach, we were able to improve the capabilities of different countries, as well as in order to, because we have been working with other partners in order to strengthen their capabilities and increase the interoperability with the Atlantic Alliance to work more efficiently together. Finally, another leg is the European Union, the collaboration of the European Union. Since the Warsaw Summit, a number of measures were implemented to strengthen cooperation, and these measures are already being fruitful in the cyber area, where a technical agreement was signed in 2016, so that the existing structures in NATO and the European Union can exchange and share experiences, and also in terms of exchange and sharing of information on different aspects in the maritime context, in the Mediterranean or other contexts. Assassin identities, as Maluf said, are the greatest threat to our societies, are the greatest threats to the values consolidated throughout centuries and the values of peaceful coexistence. What we are facing today in the 21st century is a very important turbulence that is going to shake our consciousness and intelligence in order to finally leave this long prehistory. In NATO, we try to avoid for this to happen through dialogue, through the implementation of joint measures and the creation of hubs to exchange and share information in the framework of a common and shared culture that would support the values of freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Very much. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to our third and final speaker, Carmen Romero, Deputy Assistant Secretary General for NATO Public Diplomacy, who will speak to us about disinformation as a challenge and how the Alliance can help.
Muchísimas gracias, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Good morning to one and all. I would also like to thank the Instituto Elcano for organizing this conference. I'd like to thank its chairman, Emilio Lamo, for this initiative, Luis Simon and his team in Brussels for their perseverance and their attempts to explain to the public opinion the importance of security institutions. I also want to thank the Português Institute, and let me also pay tribute to a person who's worked in the Public Diplomacy Division of NATO, José María López Navarro. I'd like to pay tribute to him because of what he's done for many years and decades to improve the perception of NATO in Spanish and Portuguese societies. So thank you, José María, for your hard work. I'd like to take this conversation where the Spanish ambassador to NATO left it. He said the main challenge is to make young people aware of the importance of NATO. so that young people will understand why NATO is so relevant and why it should continue to do what it's done so far. Partnerships like this one, like this conference that we have here today, allows us to communicate the importance of NATO to our young people. And this partnership also allows us to fight against mis and disinformation. This is a battle where we're not alone, and if we partner with NGOs, think tanks, and representatives of civil society, we'll be able to fight against this and misinformation. Let me begin by explaining how NATO sees the issue of disinformation. I've been working at NATO for many years, and we don't speak Spanish much, so I apologize if my Spanish is not up to standard. The truth is that this is a very competitive scenario for representatives of civil society, traditional media, like the ones we have here today, for young people. And the truth is that the information space is dominated by technology. Because of technology breakthroughs, there are many opportunities that we're all taking advantage of. Everyone uses a cell phone, everyone uses a tablet. But at the same time, there are opportunities. These new spaces create challenges, especially when we talk about the use of information and technology to disseminate attacks. We're talking about the main challenges that NATO will have to face, but propaganda, disinformation, and hybrid tactics are not a new phenomenon. What is new is the way these phenomena use new technologies. We face very sophisticated dis- and misinformation campaigns at great scale, which create instability in our societies, question the legitimacy of our institutions, all the institutions that are represented here today, and they also challenge traditional media. The aim of dis- and misinformation is not to convince or dissuade, but to undermine our divisions or potential divisions, polarizing public opinion, degenerating public debate, and overloading the information space. We at NATO see disinformation as yet another symptom of hybrid war. And this year, on our 70th anniversary, we have a chance to reflect upon the capacity that NATO has to adapt to the new challenges and issues. NATO, as previous speakers said, is an alliance that has been able to adapt itself to the new security threats it's had to face throughout the decades. And as the world has changed, NATO has changed, always responding to the new security space. I'm not going to dwell on which have been the different challenges and how NATO has adapted to them, because many speakers have done this before. But what I can tell you is that now that NATO is celebrating its 70th anniversary, it continues to adapt itself. It continues to innovate, to continue to be the security umbrella for almost 1 million people that live under it. It's a lot of people that we're talking about. And our adaptation can be seen also in the way we adapt to misinformation. There are many efforts we make to face hybrid challenges. So misinformation is not an isolated issue that we tackle, as part of a framework we deal with. And I would also like to refer to the declaration of the heads of state and government of July last summer at the summit of NATO, because their doctrine, and there's a phrase there that states that allied countries are facing increasing hybrid challenges, attempting to create ambiguity and blurring the line between peace, conflict, and war. It is in this gray and blurred space that we need to work in. A lot has been said about how NATO is facing hybrid challenges. And I would also like to give some examples which are slightly different from the ones that were mentioned before. NATO is trying to avail itself of a series of resources, one of which is the establishment of anti-hybrid activity support groups. These groups are already ready to be deployed in any country that might be in a hybrid situation and that requires support. And in fact, we're thinking about deploying one of them. Can't tell you where exactly, but we're ready for it. NATO is also strengthening its deterrence and defense strategies in the cyber space. For example, NATO has established a new cyber operations center. We're strengthening our cyber resilience, creating national capabilities, and a series of allies have also made available their cyber capabilities to NATO. Some of them have also used successfully their cyber capabilities against ISIS and Daesh in Iraq and Syria. We're working with a coalition in public communication, and they've told us that they're using cyber technologies to suppress terrorist propaganda, to prevent Daesh from coordinating attacks, and so that the members of the coalition can protect their forces in the combat field. As Elena said, we're also strengthening our collaboration with the EU in operational terms and in other terms. We live in an unprecedented world. A few years ago, we did very little with the EU, but since the Warsaw Summit, it's impressive to see what we've been doing with the EU. So in public awareness, fight against disinformation, we try to identify synergies, work together, sharing stories, best practices. In this way, we publish successful findings to expose cyber attacks and disinformation. We're also strengthening our cooperation using a Center of Excellence of the EU against cyber war, which is in Helsinki, and this is very important. We're meeting all the time, and we're doing many more things together to have a multiplying effect and to cooperate more. We also work together to strengthen the capacity of countries like Georgia, Moldova, North Macedonia, a country which, as you know, will probably become the 30th member of the alliance at the end of this year, beginning of next year, in order to strengthen its capabilities against disinformation. But what is NATO doing? The first step to fight against disinformation is to be aware of it, to be able to detect it. So what NATO is doing is invest in the improvement of our capacity to understand the information space, to detect interferences, hybrid actions, and fight against hostile information attacks. As Ms. Maria knows, we're developing capabilities to generate new capacities with machine learning, AI, sources of information, traditional media, social media, web analytics, open source, publicly available information, and we want to use machines so that they will do the work that our analysts are doing now, so that machines can collect data and then our analysts can understand the data. What are the goals of this capacity building efforts? First of all, identifying trends. What stories are gaining or losing prominence? Trends in the mid and long term. Not just what the media talk about or what is said in the information space, but trying to go a little further. Also identify early warning systems for potential hybrid activities. For example, to see whether certain patterns of publication happen before a certain political or military action, identifying patterns to prevent hostile actions. Another goal is to measure the effectiveness of our own communication. Are we talking to the right people? Do they understand the messages the way we want them to? And this capacity building is allowing us to strengthen our situational awareness, which is a capacity that has been strengthened as part of the internal reform of NATO. And this allows us to be very honest with ourselves and issue recommendations on whether to continue with the same communication strategies or whether to adapt them. Now, talking about strategies, yet another strategy of NATO to fight against disinformation, and in my opinion the most effective one, is to focus on our own communication strategies, trying not to distract ourselves with what happens around us and trying to innovate in the way we communicate. And the three pillars of this strategy of innovation and communication are three C's: counter messages, coordination, and communication with trust. Counter messaging means that we do not rebate or refute propaganda with more propaganda. As a previous speaker said, we are an organization of democracies. We have values, so we cannot issue dis or misinformation. We cannot make propaganda. What we need to do is respond to propaganda with facts and numbers, factual information, always upholding our values of credibility and transparency, focusing on what we do as an organization. The second C is C for coordination. When you work in public information, you need to have good coordination. The main target of disinformation is our own unit. So if we speak with a single voice, we will be stronger. So we're constantly coordinating within NATO. It's difficult because there are many stakeholders, many departments in the international staff of NATO, our partners. We build strong partnerships with other organizations like the EU or the ISIS coalition or think tanks and NGOs, because together we're stronger. And if you, the Elcano Institute, says something refuting misinformation, it's better than if NATO does it. We have to communicate with trust and confidence. We must always be prepared to explain who we are, what we do, and why. We have to be transparent and be the first ones to tell the truth. And even though it may take time, credibility is our main asset, our best asset. Our public diplomacy unit is taking action to fight against disinformation, I've been very active with the media. There's nothing that NATO does that doesn't contain a communication element to it. So we have constant, well-established interaction with the media. We work with members of civil society, and all these efforts allow us to interact with broad audiences. Our priority is public opinion in member countries. We have adapted the information campaign model, a model that the EU adopted a long time ago. We've done it more recently, and this allows us to be more effective, set ourselves targets, a few specific targets, which we will be able to assess later on. We develop our communication strategy based on audience analysis, something that NATO didn't do 3-4 years ago. And this audience analysis allows us to determine which sectors of public opinion should be our priority. All this analysis allows us to identify key audiences, messages, media, and other things that we need to use to reach those audiences. And evaluation and assessment is key as well. Our ongoing campaign, which many of you know, uses hashtag #WeAreNato, and its key audiences are youth. We know that young people in member countries do not know what NATO is. They're more familiar with the EU, but not with NATO. Women, and also non-university graduates. And based on this analysis, we've identified these are the 3 stakeholders that need more information, more communication. So we're trying to use the media they use to reach them. And this We Are NATO campaign underscores how unity is key. In spite of our differences in public, we always try to be united. Unity and solidarity between the allies is what helps preserve security in the alliance. We have to explain why NATO is important, what are the values it protects, and as some other speakers said before, we cannot take security for granted. You know this if you're an expert, but if you're a lay person who's not interested in NATO, you don't know this. So we need to convey this message to those parts of the population who are not concerned about security. And as an organization of democratic countries, we need the support of our citizens. We cannot lose the battle at home. We have to be more effective. For many years, our Public Diplomacy Division tried to do more in the partner countries than in the member countries. But now we're trying to do more with member countries and a little less with partner countries, even though we still do a lot. Through this We Are NATO campaign, the Alliance works with a series of member countries in developing their own national campaigns. So we give them some basic tools, and then member countries develop their own campaigns on NATO, because it is member states that know which are the main vulnerabilities, the main audiences, and the key strategies they can use. And let me conclude by saying that this campaign is an essential element in our strategy to fight against disinformation, with messages aimed at the most vulnerable audiences, trying to convey positive messages built on our credibility and values, and trying to be the best at developing resilience. Thank you.